Hey everybody, welcome to week four's discussion board for historical professions. So for this week's discussion, I decided to dive into the Vikings and their part that they took in the medieval slave trade time. And so I found three different sources to pull from: Stephen Brink's How Were Thralls Used, Claire Downham's The Viking Slave Trade, and then Christopher Palella's Human Trafficking in Medieval Europe. And so, what brought this to my attention was I have an interest in medieval studies as well as slave trade, and I was thinking, about the transatlantic slave trade, which is what I'm working on with my students, and I was wondering how we went from, the more ancient type of slavery to the very, very specific and singularly cruel type of slavery that we saw in the transatlantic slave trade. And when I started researching into this, I found a lot of this had to do with the Vikings, specifically the dehumanization process. And so I really started looking into all of this with that kind of ideal in mind. Some of it, admittedly, is most likely a bit of fear mongering on the part of those at the time, but at the same time, we also have some instances of cruelty that were very, similar to that we saw in the transatlantic slave trade. With Claire Downham's Entrepreneurs or Heathen Slaves was her title, and I thought that was a very interesting look into it because she specifically pulls from sources, one of which was a specific time of cruelty, and then one was a more lenient time for the slaves. And what I found was that just like most slave labor, or instances of slavery in history, it kind of depends on the individual, and they're very specific and very it depends on exactly who the master was, who the slaves are, and all kinds of stuff. Just like pretty much slave trade across history. And so it did not really break into any new discoveries, so to speak, that we haven't already found. But I did find it interesting that she had pointed out a couple different instances of both sides of the spectrum. With Christopher Palella's Human Trafficking in Medieval Europe, he focuses more on the sexual slavery kind of aspect, which was not quite where I wanted to delve, but it was occurring, and so I felt it appropriate to kind of look into that as well and really see what I could find. And the Vikings, of course, were, they had prostitutes, they had sexual slaves, but it was not really that much, honestly, in the grand scheme of things. More so, I found that they were mainly used for farming and manual labor. But at the same time, there was a social stigma of the master doing equal or even more work than his slaves. And if he wasn't, it was kind of like you were considered lazy, and it was not very well looked on in society as a whole. And so I found that really interesting. That came from Stephen Brink's How Were Thralls Used. And basically, he describes a situation of almost indentured servitude, but, with the added flavor of they kidnapped these people and then they didn't get to go home, or they didn't have the choice to stay or leave. We had instances of them escaping, of course, just like all slavery across history, but for the most part, it looked like the dehumanization process really is where a lot of Viking fear-mongering came from the surrounding countries that were being, having to deal with this the most. So I found that really interesting. I would encourage you guys to read through some of this just because if you find this topic interesting, I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, but it certainly is mine. And I love picking apart this kind of stuff and finding out the reasoning and what's true and what's not in regards to these rather heavy topics. But I hope you guys have a good week, and I'll see you next week.